Mm. Welcome to the debate. We're diving straight into really one of the most difficult and frankly polarizing moments in recent American memory, the immediate aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination. And specifically, the national conversation sparked when his widow, Erica Kirk, stood up and said those four incredibly resonant words, "I forgive him." That single statement, well, it created an instant collision between very deep personal spiritual conviction and just overwhelming political spectacle.
hmm And the challenge there, I think, is fundamental, isn't it? What happens when an act of, profound spiritual grace gets amplified and immediately framed by a massive political movement? Forgiveness really stopped being a purely private moment the second she spoke it at that enormous memorial service.
Right. So the core question today is exactly that. What was the primary impact of her public act of forgiveness? Was it this powerful, much-needed spiritual balm that somehow managed to transcend the violence and the politics? Or was it, almost inevitably, a politicized rhetorical tool that got weaponized immediately by the political machine surrounding it? As part of our mission here at Kaizen, that idea of continuous improvement in understanding, we want you to think about this too. Before we really get into it, pause right now and tell us, do you believe public forgiveness can ever be purely personal? Just write yes or no in the comments. It helps us all think through this.
It's a tough question. And look, before we state our positions, we absolutely have to acknowledge the immense tragedy here, and frankly, the difficulty of analyzing grief when it plays out so publicly.
Absolutely. So my position is this. I'll be arguing for the profound integrity and the moral necessity of her spiritual act. Her statement, I believe, stood as an undeniable witness to faith right in the middle of a moment defined by hatred and fury.
And I'll be taking the view that analyzes the complex, often contradictory context. The atmosphere of political combativeness that enveloped her words. It immediately compromised the message's purity, essentially turning it into an act within a larger political maneuver.
Okay, I understand that viewpoint, but let me offer a different frame. Erica Kirk's forgiveness was, I think, clearly a Christ-centered response. It seemed deeply rooted in her faith. Her speech was just saturated with spiritual conviction, referencing her husband's commitment, quoting his favorite verse, Isaiah 6:8, "Here I am, Lord, send me," and she explicitly mentioned finding comfort in "Thy will be done" from the Lord's Prayer.
The spiritual conviction, yes, I acknowledge that. But the purity of that moment, it felt fleeting.
But don't you see? This was fundamentally an act of personal spiritual liberation for her. She actually said she did not want the killer's blood on my ledger. She was positioning her own, eternal standing above any desire for worldly retribution. In a moment just thick with political toxicity and violence, her message offered an essential, almost non-political path forward. It felt like a necessary balm for a kind of national trauma, something that could transcend partisan lines, regardless of how others misused it later.
That's a strong argument based on her stated intent, certainly. But I have to frame it differently. Her sincerity, or at least the public perception of it, was fundamentally compromised by the immediate context of the memorial service itself. This wasn't, just a quiet church service. It was held at the State Farm Stadium's 70,000 plus capacity. It felt like a blend of a spiritual revival, a political rally, and intense patriotic pageantry.
But the words themselves, the core message, challenged that very pageantry, didn't they?
Well, yes and no. We have to remember the timeline and the optics. Just days before that memorial, she had publicly called for retribution on evildoers. She vowed the killer had ignited a fire, that her cries will echo around the world like a battle cry. So the pivot to forgiveness, while incredibly rapid, happened just as the organization she'd soon lead, Turning Point USA, or TPUSA, which is, let's be clear, one of the nation's most powerful conservative youth organizations, was launching massive fundraising efforts. The forgiveness, in effect, provided a kind of rhetorical shield for a movement that was simultaneously mobilizing for political war, receiving millions in pledges, right after the event.
See, I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning because it seems to ignore the challenge inherent in her words. The very fact that political figures, standing right there, chose to immediately pivot to calls for vengeance, well, that highlights their failure to meet her spiritual standard, not a flaw in her act itself.
But the political apparatus, the speakers who followed, they immediately defined the meaning of the event for that massive audience, largely overriding her message of grace. And crucially, President Trump followed her, stood on the same stage, and he explicitly repudiated her message, right there in front of everyone. He said something like, while Kirk did not hate his opponents, Trump himself replied, "I hate my opponent, and I don't want the best for them. I'm sorry, I am sorry, Erica."
But the existence of that repudiation, however stark it was, it actually proves the radical nature of her spiritual message. Her act of forgiveness was this powerful, necessary challenge to the prevailing culture of vengeance that Trump and others were actively promoting. It was a clear choice, echoing the Christian call to overcome evil with good, regardless of how others reacted.
But for the audience actually consuming it and the public effect is really what we're debating here. The forgiveness became this sort of moment of grace that paradoxically allowed the subsequent calls for fury to sound somehow more legitimate. Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller got up there, not echoing forgiveness, but declaring a righteous fury. He vowed the movement would destroy progressive organizations in Kirk's name. He even invoked Romans, talking about the state's power to wield the sword for the terror of evil men. That whole atmosphere, Christian nationalism, intense antagonism, it fundamentally weaponized the entire event.
But the spiritual act and the political theater, surely we have to try and separate them if we're judging the integrity of her personal witness.
Can they be separated, though? The spectacle arguably consumed the witness. I mean, consider the optics again. The pyrotechnics when she walked on stage, it turned a moment that should have been about sacred grief into, well, political theater. So the core message of loving enemies might have echoed for some, but it felt muffled by the roar of that political machine. Now, we want to hear from you on this exact point. If you heard Stephen Miller's call for righteous fury right after Erica Kirk spoke, would her forgiveness sound genuine or forced? Comment with the number 0 if you think it felt genuine, or 1 if you think it felt forced.
I agree. The immediate public reaction and the way it was packaged makes it almost impossible to cleanly separate spiritual intent from political effect, which leads us right to the next point. How was this received? Was it seen as a bomb or as propaganda?
Exactly. Because while some individuals, like I recall the mother of a slain student, who praised it purely as an act of forgiveness, while some people might have found genuine solace or healing in her words, the overall public discourse, especially online and in media commentary, immediately focused on the weaponization and, frankly, the control aspect. Think about the almost grotesque elements that started dominating the narrative, the sheer spectacle of the memorial itself. You had merchandise being sold, bulletproof glass for the speakers, even that bizarre detail about churches later playing AI-generated clips of Charlie Kirk speaking. It felt like tragedy being turned into a highly choreographed multimedia political franchise.
Okay, but the fact that TPUSA organizers might have made, let's say, questionable decisions about merchandise or using AI, that doesn't invalidate the spiritual resolve of the widow herself, does it? And furthermore, the backlash against people who were actually celebrating the assassination, surely that reflected a necessary broader societal rejection of truly hateful speech after a murder.
But that backlash advocated quickly seemed to cross a line. It went from condemning basic incivility to actively attempting to silence political opposition. The intense focus immediately shifted to discipline. You had teachers fired, students expelled, even a U.S. Secret Service agent put on leave just for a negative Facebook post. And then Attorney General Pam Bondi explicitly said she intended to target speech against Kirk as hate speech.
Well, hold on. The desire to curb genuinely hateful speech right after a national tragedy like that seemed bipartisan. You had every living former president, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Biden, they all condemned the incivility surrounding the death. That suggests a broader societal condemnation of celebrating violence, not just some partisan censorship effort.
The problem, though, is the apparent hypocrisy and the serious legal alarms raised by First Amendment experts. People like Professor Genevieve Lockyer pointed out there's no neutral definition of hate speech. And attorney Jen Eunice highlighted the irony, let's say, of a movement that constantly rails against cancel culture, now advocating for government power to silence political opponents. So the narrative of forgiveness, viewed in that light, starts to look like moral cover for a political maneuver demanding reverence while actively suppressing dissent.
That's a fairly stark assessment of the political climate, but let's shift slightly to the immediate legacy, this collision of personal faith and, well, political succession.
Which speaks directly to the immense influence she gained almost overnight.
Exactly. Her speech also cemented her commitment to continuing her husband's mission, and not just the political one, but also that cultural mission. He talked about saving the lost boys of the West, the young men feeling directionless or resentful. She spoke about family, duty, clearly informed by her commitment to the Ephesians 5 ideal, which is often associated with traditional gender roles. This highlights her dedication to preserving the movement's cultural foundations.
But inheriting a massive organization and a huge fundraising wave, TPUSA reportedly got 62,000 new signups, millions in donations right after, while simultaneously offering forgiveness. I mean, that makes the whole event a profound demonstration of political influence, not just personal grief. Her ability to step right into leadership, now heading one of America's most powerful conservative platforms, it really suggests that this spiritual act also served as the dramatic founding moment of a new political era for the movement, heavily subsidized by, mega donors.
Or you could see her immediate willingness to step into that role as a profound example of leadership emerging directly from tragedy, fulfilling a calling that perhaps transcends simple financial metrics. She became the guardian, the preserver of a cultural movement she clearly deeply believes in.
I don't disagree it fulfills a calling, but the sheer scale of the financial and political boost that came with it proves that in today's hyper-polarized public sphere, even the deepest, most sincere spiritual acts can't easily escape being repurposed. In this case, it functioned as the official, tearful launch of a political ascendancy. The personal act instantly yielded immense political and financial power.
So to summarize my view, Erica Kirk's statement demonstrated, I believe, true and immense spiritual strength in the face of just unspeakable tragedy. It served as a powerful, even radical reminder of the command to love one's enemies. The fact that political allies and even opponents immediately tried to exploit or ignore that act doesn't diminish the profound moral ideal it offered, especially to a deeply wounded segment of the nation.
And from my perspective, while the individual intent behind the forgiveness may well have been sincere in her heart, the political apparatus surrounding her ensured that the message was immediately repurposed, not really as a shield against political warfare, but almost as the justification for it. It became a defining cultural moment that simultaneously elevated her movement and had the effect of suppressing dissent across the country.
What this moment really reveals, I think, is a fundamental American paradox. It's the immense strain that occurs when deep personal faith runs headlong into the massive machinery of political spectacle, media, and polarization.
It is. It's a really sobering reflection on maybe the fragility of purely spiritual acts when they're filtered through the industrial scale of modern political media. We're left grappling with that tension between individual integrity and overwhelming systemic influence.
And before you go, we really encourage you, our listeners, to continue reflecting on this difficult tension yourselves. Which element of this event, the spiritual core or the political context, do you believe ultimately had the more lasting impact? We'd genuinely love to see your thoughts in the comments below. If this discussion helped clarify the complexity of this moment, please give this discussion a like right now. Thanks for joining us on The Debate.